please welcome Dave Montgomery.
Thank you, Matt. Well, thank you all for coming today and for the opportunity to talk to you. I'm a geologist. I've gotten into the habit of trying to write books for a popular audience. Why? Well, in great part because I don't think enough scientists actually take the time these days to try and communicate with people outside of scientific disciplines. And there's an awful lot of issues for which the perspectives and understanding of the scientific community are actually really important for shaping the decisions society needs to make over the next century. And the books that I've written sort of deal with sort of two issues. King of Fish and Dirt look at the relationship between humanity and our environment, the natural resources we depend on, fish and soil, respectively, in those books. And that issue, the relationship of people to our environment, is one of the big challenges of the 21st century. The other one, I think, is the relationship between science and religion. And that's what my forthcoming book is about, Rocks Don't Lie. And why would I think to write books about those two issues? Because I don't think enough people think about them, talk about them, and are aware of those issues and how much they may actually shape the future of human societies. If we look at the environment, for example, we fundamentally depend on the soil for our livelihood. 97% of our food comes directly or indirectly from the soil. It's the one natural resource we have that we don't tend to think of as a strategic resource. And yet, thinking like a geologist, over the course of centuries and millennia, being actually fairly small units of time in the history of the world or human societies, soil is every bit as important and fragile as the atmosphere, as the water, as energy sources, and yet we tend to take it for granted. We literally treat it like dirt. That's the pun in the book. And yet, we can't afford to over the long run. Because if you look back at the history of human societies, you look back at the Bronze Age Europe, the classical Greeks, the Romans, North Africa, the Middle East, Easter Island, China, the American South, society after society that abused their land, that abused their soil, that eroded and degraded the ability of the land to actually produce the crops that we depend on to feed ourselves, that we depend on so that we don't all have to be farmers. Those societies have only lasted a certain amount of time. And dirt is essentially an exploration of the hypothesis that what actually has contributed to the demise of ancient civilizations was agriculture. If you look back at environmental history books, you'll find the argument that deforestation led to soil erosion, that led to the decline of societies as the ability to produce food was overmatched by the population. But what I found in my research is essentially there was a different story. It was actually the way that agriculture has been practiced in society after society, primarily through the use of the plow, that undermined the ability of the soil to sustain societies over the long run. And so this book essentially explores that hypothesis through looking at archaeology, through looking at modern science, and basically comes up with the answer that the rate at which we're losing soil today globally, which comes out at about 1 millimeter a year on average off croplands the world over, sounds like a very slow rate. Only a geologist can get really excited about something that happens at 1 millimeter a year, right? Your fingernails grow faster than that. But if you have plenty of time, 1 millimeter a year, what does that add up to? Well, most soils on most parts of the world are only about 1 to 3 feet thick, so that's about 30 to 100 centimeters, that's 300 to 1,000 millimeters. That means that in just a few centuries, to less than 1,000 years, a society can quite literally plow through their holding down their fertile topsoil. And society after society has done this. There's examples that I talk about in the book of societies that didn't do this, that actually took care of their soil. The Chinese, in terms of returning nutrients to the soil, the Inca, who did the same thing, or Amazonian Indians, the Dutch, they all built very fertile soils through the application of organic matter and labor back to the land. But they're the exceptions, not the rule, in the sweep of human history. Why would somebody like me be sort of really interested in advertising this and talking about it? Well, because we're now an integrated global society, and we don't have other planets to go to and to actually use soils if we use our supply of soil today up. We need to not learn the lesson, or we actually need to learn the lesson, we did not repeat the lesson of ancient societies today on a global scale. And yet we're on track to do that. If you look at the rate of soil loss in the world today, we've lost about a third of our cropland in the last 50, 60 years, since about the Second World War. We've lost cropland to erosion and soil degradation that's equivalent to the size of India and China combined. Now, if you look at the projections of the human population for the next 50 years, we need to find the ability to feed another 50% increase in the people on the planet. If we actually make it to a 10 billion person planet, we need to find ways to actually feed everybody. It would be a lot easier if we still had that third of our cropland in full productive capacity that we had at the end of the Second World War. That's my contention, the argument I'm trying to make in this book, and in my speaking, is that we need to rethink our relationship with the soil. Because we actually can take care of the soil, take care of the land in ways that produce enough food to feed the world. But we're on a path, we're on a trajectory that will make it harder and harder to actually do that over the course of the next few decades. But if we look at soil as essentially a secret weapon in dealing with some of the key issues, key environmental issues of the 21st century, and we think about the land differently, we actually have an opportunity to turn some of these trends around. If you look at soil essentially as an investment, an intergenerational trust that we can reinvest in, what does it mean? It means reshaping and rethinking the way we do agriculture. And it doesn't mean going back to medieval agriculture. It means using sort of modern ecological science to develop what I would call agroecology. How to essentially use organic agriculture and something called no-till agriculture, the idea of not plowing, because plowing leaves the land bare and vulnerable to wind or rain for part of the year, and that's what allows erosion to race ahead of soil production and sort of gradually bleed the soil off the landscape. In other words, we actually could use soils as an opportunity to address three of the big fundamental environmental problems facing humanity this century. Not many people know that about a third of the carbon dioxide that's gone into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution came from degraded soil organic matter. It came from plowing up the Great Plains, plowing up the steppes of Russia. We can put an awful lot of carbon back in the ground if we change the way we do agriculture. We can also increase soil fertility at the same time that we farm intensively, if we farm a little differently. And we can also, by reinvesting in the life within soils, reinvesting in the organic matter in soils, improve the quality of life for people in urban environments. We're now officially an urban species. Half of humanity lives in cities today. And the supply of organic matter and labor there in cities would enable people to essentially produce a surprising amount of food within cities, but we can only do that by rebuilding soils in cities. How many other environmental problems are there where you can address three of the big problems facing humanity with one root cause, improving the quality of soil? I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt put it best in terms of soils and the relationship to human society in 1937 when he wrote in a letter to the governors of the then all 48 U.S. states that a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. His words are as pertinent today and as prophetic today as they were in the immediate aftermath of the Dust Bowl, but they're perhaps even more important as we sort of race through the 21st century. We can't afford to not learn the lesson of ancient societies in terms of how we deal with our land and deal with our soils. But the other issue that I was going to speak about was such the issue of the relationship between science and religion. Because how we view the world, how we view our place in the world, shapes the way we look at things like the land, look at things like the soil, look at how we might address some of the fundamental environmental problems, or even indeed whether we need to address environmental problems, are all shaped by our worldviews. And what would a geologist do looking at that issue? Well, I essentially wrote a book about the relationship of how geologists have looked at the stories of Noah's flood and other flood stories around the world, not to try and promote any particular worldview, not to promote any particular bias in that, but to essentially try and look at how those stories illustrate the long-running conversation between science and religion. And Noah's flood is perhaps, with the story of Noah's flood and arguments over it, is one of the longest-running conversations between science and religion. How to view faith, how to view science, how to view the relationship between what we're taught and what we can go see for ourselves out in the natural world. And as a scientist, I wasn't trained to actually think about or look at those issues. And in doing the research for the book, I found it very illuminating about how long, for thousands of years, there's been a conversation between theologians and natural philosophers, later scientists, about how to view the world, how to think about things. And we're all familiar with battles over the teaching of evolution in public schools, and what we don't tend to know is that the creationist view of that we live on a 6,000-year-old planet shaped by Noah's flood was known to be wrong long before Charles Darwin started even talking about evolution. long before the whole cultural wars that have been raging in this country for the last century were really even imagined or thought about. People don't know the history of the relationship and the cross-pollination between science and religion. And I wanted to try and look at the story is one of much more of cross-pollination and people seeking to define how the truth should be looked at than the story of conflict that we tend to know in terms of our cultural dialogue these days. Few really know how the rise of modern creationism came from a failure of geologists to find evidence of a global flood. Because there's really no evidence that a global flood ever happened. And in the mid-19th century, there are all kinds of theological arguments about, oh, well, what kind of a local flood could have happened? Could it have been the flooding of the Caspian Sea, a flood in Mesopotamia? What might have actually explained the origin of many flood stories? And if you actually look at the geography of flood stories, this region, in the Pacific Northwest, there are many Native American stories of floods that came from the sea that read like eyewitness descriptions of tsunamis. If you look at stories from around the ice sheets in Scandinavia and Eurasia, there's stories about glacial dam break floods. I discovered a site like that in eastern Tibet, working on research there, and it turned out that the locals had a story about the flood that I had thought that I'd discovered, and yet they knew all about it. And it happened 1,200 years ago. Oral histories, stories about the way that geological processes shape the earth, can actually be surprisingly resilient and long-lived. And of course, there's the idea about the story of Noah's flood being when the Mediterranean Sea rose at the end of the last glaciation. Because when the ice melts off the poles, the sea level comes up, it overtopped the drainage basin going into the Black Sea, filled the Black Sea up like a bathtub. And geologists seriously proposed about a decade ago that this was a logical explanation for the root of the story of Noah's flood. Creationists were outraged because it wasn't a global flood. And so today we have this wonderful irony that geologists are proposing rational explanations for some of the world's oldest stories that are enshrined in some of the world's oldest religions. And yet, some of the adherents are questioning that. So you have this interesting dialogue between science and religion that runs back a long time. How do you interpret things, literally or allegorically? There's a fundamental conversation that's been going on that we don't tend to hear sort of adult conversations, if you will, in the popular media. We tend to hear people sort of screaming at each other from either side of the philosophical aisles. And yet if you look back at the history, it's a far more interesting and engaging and cross-pollinating story than you would ever be led to believe by simply reading the newspapers. So the relationship between science and religion, between humanity and our environment, between humanity and nature, really are at the heart of some of the major issues we face in the 21st century. And the ability to think clearly about them, to understand the history, to know where we've been so that we can think about where we want to go, is one of the reasons that I've written these books and that I speak on these topics in public. And I would invite you all to essentially think about them more deeply, because sometimes if you look back at the history, it can be really, really illuminating. And topics that are very sensitive to talk about. And people would all have their own ideas about how to deal with natural resources, their favorite resources, how to do the trade-offs between economics and environmental conversation. And then, of course, we all have our own ideas about and traditions about religions. But by looking at the history and the context, I think it's a lot easier to think about them and talk about them without engaging in everybody just sort of going to their corner and defending their own preconceived ideas. So that's what I'm really trying to do at some level in writing these books, is to get people thinking. Because in the end, we should all be thinking for ourselves about these issues. And if we ignore the role and lessons of history in them, we're not really playing with full information. So, but thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you today, and look forward to future opportunities. Yes?
When you talk about the flood, do you see that happening again in the future here in America, or do you...
You know, there's certainly a possibility. There's been changes to agricultural practices that have helped to minimize that. But many of the changes that happened in the aftermath of the Dust Bowl, like putting windbreaks in between the farms, those then got plowed over back in the 70s and 80s. The big reason that I would argue is that looking 40, 50 years out, the propensity for a Dust Bowl-like event is going to get real low, is that no-till farming is being increasingly adopted in the heart of the old Dust Bowl. And what no-till farming is that instead of plowing, you leave the crop stubble from last year and you plant through it. And so you're essentially leaving an organic mulch on the land surface. And so then when the wind blows across, it won't be able to pick up the fine soil underneath. So it's getting better, but the potential still is there at the moment for something probably not as dramatic as the Dust Bowl, but something that could be fairly devastating. There had been 13, I think, great droughts in the Dust Bowl before the one that kicked all the soil up and blew it to the East Coast. And why didn't those cause an effect? Because the prairie plains were pretty much sutured together by grass. So there's the potential for it. I think that the bigger worry in terms of erosion in this country and globally is the longer-term slow loss of the soil, not so much one big catastrophic drought and event, but the continued loss of just millimeter a year after millimeter, which you let it play out for a century and it can cause incredible damage to our ability to feed people. So it's the long, slow bleed is the bigger worry I have about the future on erosion is the long, slow bleed of soil off of our fields rather than the catastrophic event, of which there is still some potential for. Sorry, it's a long answer to your question. Yes?
You talked kind of about the interplay between, potential allegory and scientific fact or inquiry. What are your thoughts about, you talked about the adult discussion of these two issues and the interplay, but of either one mutually excluding the other? Because, a lot of the time I think you hear it's one or the other, and if this one's right, then this one's wrong, or, and you don't hear a lot of kind of cross-pollination, if you will, of saying that there could be, facets of both that are correct and kind of interact with each other. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's exactly why I wrote that book, is because I saw that in the cultural dialogue, you don't tend to see, no one's talking about the middle ground. And yet, if you sit and think deeply about it, I think that's where a lot of people would end up, is in that middle ground. There's certain things that in terms of the relationship between science and religion, we can say, yes, they're mutually exclusive. The idea that the sun circles the earth, that's what Galileo got in trouble for challenging. And scientifically, there's no way to defend a religious view that the sun goes around the earth, no matter what religion you're trying to invoke for. And so there's certain issues. And Stephen Jay Gould basically tried to define science and religion in sort of nice separate boxes that dealt with totally different things, and that gets into trouble over the very issue you're asking about. And so what I would essentially argue, and since I'm not trying to promote any particular view or religion, is that if there are things that we can demonstrate through science that are either most likely correct or pretty assuredly wrong, those things are probably not the things we want to hinge whatever religious views we want to have. That they're not the best anchors for spiritual things or concerns. And so if we look at, say, like the age of the world, it's undoubted, it's 4.5 billion years old. And geologists have been rock solid, if you'll pardon the pun case, on the age of the Earth. There's absolutely no evidence that there was a global flood ever in geological history, unless you go like way far back. And maybe there was a brief one when during some of the mass extinction events, but the last one was like 65 million years ago. So the idea that you can basically refute certain religious propositions with science, but what science will never be able to refute is, what's the nature of God? Where did the universe come from? Those are issues that are by design, if you'll pardon the other pun, outside the realm of science. And I think a lot of people who engage in those discussions don't really recognize that as the distinction. Both that there can be things that are mutually exclusive. Science is capable of disproving certain religious beliefs. But then that puts the onus, I think, back on theologians to look at those particular beliefs and go, oh, is there a different way to think about that? Is this truly a conflict? Or is this a matter of interpretation that maybe we've read something either too deeply or too shallow or perhaps wrong? And if you look, the thing that fascinated me in doing the research for Rocks Don't Lie was just how long-running that argument has been and how many times it's happened before, and how creatively people have tried to wrestle with those apparent contradictions. Sorry, again, it's a long answer, but that's kind of what I do.